Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first installment of the Jean Mard Historic Lecture Series. We're having these talks once a month from now through December, and we're highlighting the history of a different ethnic group or historic group within our diocese. So today we're going to be talking about Fr Barriere. Next month we'll have Father Chester Arsenault will talk about the history of Black Catholics in our diocese. And we have Father David Rosas will join us and speak about the Vietnamese experience, and followed by Father Deacon Juan Pagan will speak about the Hispanics. This talk is brought to you by a generous grant from the Louisiana Endowment for Humanities, and they've given us generous funding to have this talk, and we appreciate their efforts to support humanities in Lafayette. We have some questionnaires in the back. If you wouldn't mind filling out, you can take with you and send them back, or if you would fill them out tonight, that would be much appreciated. We also have some flyers about the upcoming lectures in this series. So I'd like to introduce Fr Jason Vidrine to you. Fr Vidrine is a native of Ville-Platte, c'est vrai? Went to Bayou Chico High School, I read, and was the valedictorian of his class, and entered the seminary in, what year was it? 1998. Fr Vidrine is now, he's the pastor of St. Martin de Tours Parish in St. Martinville, and I know they are blessed to have him. And he has a passion for history, genealogy. You may see his wonderful cooking videos on his kudu on his social media page. So without further ado, I'll welcome Fr Jason Vidrine.
Thank you, Christy. Bonsoir à tous de vous autres, ici et aussi sur le Facebook live stream. Good evening to all of you. Thanks for coming. It's a great joy to be here. I want to thank Father Arsenault, Father Chester. I had the joy of working with at Our Lady of Wisdom as his parochial vicar, and Christy for your great work here. I'm excited to come and speak for the Jean Mard lectures for this bicentennial of the cathedral, and I thought it was good to begin with the pastor who founded the cathedral, right? Who started this great and historic church. This is a quote that I start with. Fr Barriere lived an extraordinary life as a tremendous priest, and yes, that life should be better known, particularly by those who owe much to his loving service to their ancestors and their parish's history. May he now enjoy true rest from his labors and receive the reward of eternal happiness promised to those who remain faithful, even through persecution and the hardships of missionary life. It's actually a quote by me. It concluded an article that I prepared and researched and wrote about his life about 8 years ago. You can see there, right, his life should be better known. And so certainly I'm grateful that he is the subject of the first lecture of the Jean Mard series during this bicentennial. He should be better known. Start with another quote. Father Donald Hebert, right, the great genealogist, says, Fr Barriere was a real friend to the genealogist and historical researcher. He never realized that many years after he died, there would be people like ourselves who would appreciate the exactitude and completeness with which he recorded the everyday events of church and sacramental life for his flock. So not just to historians or historical researchers or genealogists, but really to all Catholics, I think we are indebted certainly to Fr Barriere and his incredible work, which hopefully we'll see tonight. Why would he be a real friend to the genealogist and historical researcher, and especially known or should be known to Catholics here in our diocese? First of all, he was a real apostle to all of southwestern Louisiana, so serving all of what today is called Acadiana. He was pastor first of the Atacapa post, St. Martinville, then the Opelousas post, St. Landry, and then the founder of St. John at Vermilionville. So really the three oldest churches of the diocese or of the area, he was pastor of them all. And the meticulous and complete sacramental records that he kept at each of those, including many details from personal knowledge he had in Europe and in Louisiana. So he would relate facts from the Atacapa posts, naming people he knew to people of the Opelousas post, right? And same thing when he arrived in Lafayette or Vermilionville. And so this is a map of the area that he served. First of all, we can see there the approximate boundary. So this was the Attakapas post. You can see there that Lafayette, Vermilionville is right there. Broussard, New Iberia, St. Martinville, Attakapas, Carencro, all the way up to Grand Prairie, right? So this huge territory was the Attakapas post. Then when he moved north to the Opelousas post, it was everything above the Attakapas post, right? And then eventually to Vermilionville or Lafayette itself, right? So a huge geographical region to serve as a priest. Fr Barriere was born in Bordeaux, southwestern France, May 30th, 1755. So we're talking about 10 years before the Acadians arrived in Louisiana, 1765. Actually, some had come immediately after the deportation, a few, but most of them arrived 10 years later after journeying around the world. So he was baptized in Bordeaux, there in southwestern France. And his first assignment as a priest, entering the seminary, then getting ordained, was at the hospital for abandoned children or orphans in Bordeaux, which he served from the time of his ordination till the revolution in France began, right? And many of you are probably familiar with the revolution in France. The peasants rose up against the monarchy, and the church was right in the crosshairs, right? And many of the priests who refused to swear allegiance to the crown, to the new revolutionary government, were in many ways given tremendous persecution, even torture, and some of them even died. Many of them even died. And it was especially bad in Bordeaux, where he was from, in the southwest of France. There was a real revolutionary spirit, and priests who did not swear the oath to the new government, which was an atheistic government, were either incarcerated and put to death, or incarcerated and thrown out of France, or incarcerated and died there in jail. Not simply put to death, but dying in jail. And so he was, Fr Barriere, first of all, incarcerated by the revolutionary government. He refused to swear the oath, as his pastor did, refused as well. And so he was forced to flee France in 1792, right? So 1792. His passport to leave France was on May 8th, 1793. He formally left France. And Fr Barriere arrived in Baltimore, in America, the only diocese at the time, in 1792. The oldest of our dioceses in what is the United States of America. And Bishop Carroll, the Bishop of Baltimore, received him. Some of you may know Bishop Carroll was the brother of John Carroll, the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence, right? So there was a great unity, if you will, between the first bishop of the first diocese of America with one of the signers of the Declaration. But Bishop Carroll received him like he did other immigrants who were priests, and he appointed him to one of the second oldest dioceses in America, which was in Bardstown, Kentucky, right? So he sent him to the missions in Kentucky, where some of the French had settled and others certainly had settled. He appointed him as his vicar general for the missions even. And he sent with him one of the seminarians who came as a seminarian to America and then was ordained the first priest in America, Father Stephen Theodore Baden. So here's a map in 1810 of the dioceses in America, right? You can see Baltimore there, and then certainly New Orleans, which was not an American diocese, but first of all French, and then Cuba, Spanish, and then American. But in 1795 to 1800, it was only Baltimore and Bardstown, and then the others got established by 1810, as you can see. But still, these are just a few dioceses, right? This is Father Stephen Baden, the first priest ordained in America. So he was newly ordained and went with Fr Barriere to the missions in Kentucky. And he actually is considered in one way the founder of Notre Dame University in South Bend, Indiana. His land became where South Bend is, where the university is, and he's buried in the university chapel there at Notre Dame University in the floor. Father Stephen Theodore Baden, the first priest ordained in America. So the two of them were sent to Kentucky, to the missions, and it was a very rural area, of course, in 1793. They went by horseback to some of the communities around Bardstown, and often on horseback they would take two different routes, go to two different areas, if you will, but also come together. One curious note is if you go to Bardstown, the old cathedral, it looks very much like St. Martin de Tours Church in St. Martinville, very similar in architecture and the look of it. It's no longer a diocese. It was suppressed and became Louisville, Kentucky, but it was the oldest, or one of the oldest dioceses after Baltimore. However, Fr Barriere did not speak English very well. He did some, and so he wanted to come to where French speakers were, which was South Louisiana, right? And he convinced Bishop Carroll to go. Bishop Carroll wasn't happy, but he allowed it. And Father Baden was even more upset, right? He said, he was sent out here with me, now he's going to leave me all alone in the missions of Kentucky, right? But Fr Barriere headed south on the Mississippi. Along the way, he was arrested by the Spanish authorities who were governing Louisiana. They thought he was a French spy, right? And he ended up being able to convince them to come as a missionary to South Louisiana, a French speaker, and they allowed him to come. When he arrived in New Orleans, the Vicar General appointed him as pastor of St. Martin de Tours in St. Martinville. So St. Martin de Tours was established in 1765 when the Acadians arrived, and so he's arriving about 30 years after the parish was founded, right? But they had not had a pastor in all those years. They had several itinerant priests who served for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, Spanish Capuchins and others. So he's really the first resident priest or pastor that takes over the Atacapa post, which he arrived in April 1795. In March he was appointed, and he arrived in April 1795. So this is his appointment letter, right, by the Archbishop of Cuba, Spanish regime. Father Bernard Barriere is priest immigrated from France, is appointed to the parish of St. Martin at Atacapa on this day. The church at St. Martinville was a simple wooden church, and this is something of a reproduction of what it would have looked like. We don't have an actual picture, but very similar to the church at Pointe-Coupee, which was the oldest, and similar to the church at Opelousas, a square frame wooden church. And so arriving in St. Martinville, Fr Barriere realized the immensity of the territory, right? Much bigger than he would have served in France in any parish, right? You have those villages in France that had their own churches and maybe 300 or 400 people. Here, he's got many people and much territory. So he shows really his missionary zeal through the records that we find in the parish that he meticulously kept, right? And just to give you a glimpse, just like he had done at Bardstown, here in South Louisiana, he mounted a horse and went on what he would call little salidas, little journeys to minister to the people in his territory. So this is what one historian, Father Suve, says. From the testimony of the church registers of St. Martin, it appears that during the time of his incumbency, from 1795 to 1804, Fr Barriere visited this neighborhood some 15 times. These little salidas, to use his own expression, took him habitually 3 or 4 days. His customary stations were about the site of the modern village of Carencro, at Miss Arsenault and Pierre Hébert's, although we find him occasionally stopping with Pierre Bernard, François Cormouche, Joseph Mire, Joseph Bro, and in 1804, Frédéric Mouton. Farther south at the Grand Prairie, Fr Barriere found a large plantation of Jean Mouton, Toncle dit Chapeau, as he was called, and he never failed to go there when passing through. Once in a while, we meet him also at the house of Marin Mouton, Jean's brother, and of Anselme Thibodeau, Don Nicolas Rousseau, Joseph Hébert, Louis Trahan, and Pierre Trahan. Still farther down along the bayou, he sometimes visited Miss Dago and the Landrys while at the Côte Gelée, which today is Broussard, right, down there. And he was twice the guest of Don Jean-Baptiste Broussard and once of Jean-Baptiste Comeau. It's important, I think, to note here, right, he visited, every time he came on these little salidas, Jean Mouton and his plantation, which we're actually on tonight as we gather, right? And we'll see that later when he becomes the founding pastor of the Church of St. John here. It was on the plantation of Jean Mouton, who he visited as the pastor of Saint-Martin-de-Tours, right? And then Father Suve points out that it didn't stop there. He says, should anyone be tempted to think that his pastoral visits to these quarters were too rare or far apart, let him bethink himself that the good man had, besides his flock of St. Martin and along the Vermilion, other sheep that were not of his fold, this fold. And so the territory under his spiritual care was immense, and we see him once in a while saddle his horse for trips down the Bayou Teche, as he writes, the Prairie Saint-Jacques, the Côte des Anglais, the Prairie Salée, the Côte des Allemands, returning by way of New Iberia, which was already in existence and known by that name, where he stopped at the house of Joseph Sangerman, a native of Fort Chart, Illinois. At other times, he had to direct his course down the Bayou Vermilion, or, as he puts it, in El Parage de la Punta, the point, where he assembled the scattered Catholics of the neighborhood in the habitation of Miss Claude Martin. So, literally going up to Carencro, Grand Prairie, then coming down to Broussard, the Côte Gelée, then going down all the way to the Côte des Allemands, down by Uteche, then back up to St. Martinville. We'll see in a minute kind of the way that it worked, but in 1805, he was replaced by Father Gabriel Issaby as the pastor at St. Martin-de-Tours, but he remained in St. Martinville in residence, where he kept doing these missionary journeys, helping Father Issaby there until 1813. So he was a great help to Father Issaby when he arrived. So, for example, on March 31st, 1812, right, he was celebrating the marriage au Quartier de Carencro of Jean-Baptiste Benoit of Opelousas and Helene Roger of Carencro. And went back a week later and even noted sent by Father Issaby for the marriage of Joseph Hébert and Justine Guilbeault. And just a few months later, he was au Vermilion, witnessing the marriage of Joseph Guidry and Marie Comeau, right? So all the way until he left St. Martinville, either while he was pastor or in residence, he continued to make these missionary journeys. Let's look a little bit about those journeys. First of all, when he arrived at St. Martinville, he found that all of the sacraments celebrated since 1765, right, those 30 years, were all on loose leaf sheets of paper and in danger of being lost, right? So if you go to St. Martinville and look at the oldest registers, you'll find his handwriting and his signature, because what he did was copied all of those little papers, right, and preserved them, if you will, in the register. So he wrote in St. Martinville, the very first register. Here are all of the baptisms, burials, and marriages concerning the first years of existence of this parish of St. Martin of Atacapa from 1756 to 1794. Then he goes on to describe what he found when he came, all the little notes, if you will, by all those priests since the parish was established. And then he goes on to list the first baptism all the way to when he had arrived, right? So the first baptism was by a Capuchin priest, Fr Didier, a Benedictine priest, Fr Didier, but this is Fr Barriere's handwriting, right, who he copied all those acts. So this is why Father Hebert said he is a great friend to the historical researcher and genealogical, interest, one who has interest, because he was greatly involved in keeping the records so that we could have them later. Look at this list of the Acadian and non-Acadians that Father Barriere ministered to from 1805 to 1809, right? John Apsher from Pennsylvania, Jean Apsher from Germany, probably the same man, but who had gone from Germany to Pennsylvania. Benjamin Andrus, Jacques Arnaud. You go down the list, these are the people he came into contact with and celebrated sacraments for from literally all over the world, settled in South Louisiana, right? Many different settlers from many places. But at St. Martin de Tours especially, he encountered the Acadians, right, especially who had settled there. So Pierre Arsenault, Alexandre Aucoin, Ignace Babin, Etienne Benoit, Jean Bernard. Many of these are either the original settlers from Acadie or their children, right? So you're talking about first generation or second generation people he ministered to. And he gives the spouse name, of course, in all of those records, and often will indicate where they were from. So chances are, if any of you descend from any of the Acadians, Father Barriere ministered to them, right? As well as many of the non-French. But you could see here, right, I was saying the missionary journeys that he would take from St. Martin de Tours all around the Atacapa region. And so he was at Carencro at Arsenault's house, Bayou Vermilion at François Lambert's house, Bayou Vermilion at Lucien Bourque's house, Joseph Boudreau, Carencro at Jean Comeau's, the Upper Bayou Teche, Pierre Hébert and Don Martin Doral, all the way to the Cypress Island down there. And these are some of the places he mentions, right, that showing the vast territory he had and the way in which he ministered to them with great missionary joy. Chafalaya, Fosse Point, Bayou Teche, the Lower Vermilion, Carencro, Opelousas, on the lake, Côte Gelée, and Parc Perdu, and then Prairie Sorel, the Grand Point, Bayou Tortue, New Iberia, Bayou Teche, Cypress Island. So you get the sense really of the extent of his missionary journeys. And this list kind of gives an idea, right? So we see that from the 11th of September through the 18th of September, he visits these different habitations away from St. Martinville, right? And then he goes back to St. Martinville. And then from the 9th of October to the 14th of October, he visits these various homes. And then again from 5th of January, the 19th of January, February. So he would go for about a week, make his rounds, right? And go back to St. Martinville. And they said he was always at the church of St. Martin de Tours on Sunday, especially for Mass, and then all day long, for sure, to minister to the people. But then during the week would go on these missionary journeys. Tremendous, really. And there is a story while in residence at St. Martin, so we're talking about from about 1805, after he was no longer the pastor, to about 1813. There was one particular instance when all of those faithful missionary works were almost crowned with martyrdom. He was traveling around Lake Chitamacha down there, and he was met up with a group of hostile Indians by surprise. They were more than ready to torture him and to put him to death. They had already wrenched the nails off his fingers and toes when the head of the tribe suddenly arrived, and he surprisingly protected Fr Barriere, commanding that the torture be stopped immediately, and even took care of him, making sure he returned safely to his home on the Teche, right, St. Martinville. But once again, I think Fr Barriere showed his great humility and modesty by neither recording this heroic struggle for the faith in the registers, nor ever alluding to it in the many notes that he made in his parish registers. And the way that we know this is from one of the descendants of the Chitamacha Indians, right, who recorded it with an early historian of the church, Father Sauvé, early on. So we see not only was he faithful and zealous, but also tremendously humble. He could have been martyred, right, but thanks to God's grace was not, and never even mentioned it in the meticulous records he kept at St. Martin de Tours, right? And so, serving the Atacapa post, he was then sent by the bishop to the Opelousas post, right, which is again north of the Atacapa post. And he arrives in 1813, where he would serve as the pastor for 5 years, and then once again remain in residence in Opelousas from 1818 to 1822. So for a good number of years, helping out the pastor who succeeded him. And so just like he did at St. Martinville, at Opelousas, he began to take these missionary journeys through the Opelousas post. And this is what we see from the records. Even though he was no longer young, from Opelousas, he traveled to the Prairie Mamou, to James Campbell's, then to Miss Hall's, then again to Dennis McDaniel's at the head of, he said, Bayou Chico, then to the quartier called Baton Rouge, which was today Take Cove, near Ville Platte, Louisiana, at the house of Monsieur Jean-Baptiste de Vidrine, then to the Prairie Mamou, and finally at Pierre Foray's in the Prairie Rhone, right? So again, making these tremendous missionary journeys. And you can see here kind of that area. So the Opelousas Post Church was originally in Washington, which is today Washington, and it was later moved to Opelousas, where it is today. But you see Nouvelle Église right here in Opelousas, but he was way over here in Mamou, where Eunice would be, right, up Bayou Chico, Ville Platte, with these missionary journeys. This is one example, right? So you could see in the records in Opelousas, this is the fourth habitation he stops at, right, in the Opelousas post on that journey. He says, dans le quartier dit du Baton Rouge, which we don't know why it was named that, but it's found in both civil and sacramental records, that name. And it's at literally the meeting place between Take Cove and Ville Platte today on the Take Cove Road. He was with my fifth great grandfather, Monsieur Baptiste de Vidrine, that day. And he lists the sacraments he performed in that house, right? And Celeste McDaniel, Claire McDaniel, Damascene Ardigo, and a few others, right? So once he arrived back at the church at St. Landry, he would write down all of the information from his missionary journeys, right? And all of their information. And it's incredible, really, the way in which he wrote the baptismal entries, right? Giving so much information. So we have this example right here with number 116, Damascene Ardigo. In the year 1813, the 18th day in the month of November, I, the undersigned, Michel Bernard Barriere, pastor of this parish of St. Landry of Opelousas, have baptized solemnly a little girl born the 10th of June of this year, legitimate daughter of Jean-Francois Ordigo, native of Pensacola, right, and of Eugenie Fontenot, native of this parish. The grandparents being Joachim Ordigo, native of Tordesillas, the kingdom of Spain, right, Castile in Europe, and of Maria de Soto Saint-Denis, native of Natchitoches, right, the daughter of the founder of Natchitoches, Juchereau de Saint-Denis. So these are the kind of details he gives, right, where their parents or grandparents were from, even naming specific places in Europe, right? And he makes reference in some of them that he knew their ancestors in Europe, right, or knew of them, which is tremendous when you think about it, having come from France to Louisiana. So this is the habitation of Pierre Vidrine in Ville-Platte, modern-day Ville-Platte. Right north of it, Take Cove, the Quartier de Baton Rouge. He was here for those baptisms we just looked at, McDaniels and Ordigos. And in the records of Opelousas, what we see is that he comes behind the Spanish pastor's registers and writes many, many little notes. And this is what Fr Barriere was fascinated by, right? So these baptisms in 1782 at St. Landry, Fr Barriere arrives in 1813, right? And he begins to, in the margins, write what he knows. So this is a Gradnigo at the Opelousas Post, and he says, all of these that comprised in this book from the name Gradnigo come from the same family. It's a family of, and he gives his name, right, and tells where he came from, right, and the history of him. Then he'll go to each of those registers and write those notes. And we see this, right, again and again in the register. So the Spanish pastor had recorded the sacrament, and he goes behind and says, see page 90, it's the same family, and who they are, right? And so, in a sense, it gives us, I think, a hint at, as he grew older, he might have had a little more free time to go through all those records, right? And then give knowledge that was not there, give insights into who the people were, and kind of make connections within the records that the Spanish pastors had not made, right? So that's why he's known for the meticulous notes in the registers, right? So he says here, the first legitimate daughter of who the parents were, then he signs Fr Barriere, priest, right? Just tons and tons of these records. It's important, especially for my family, right? Because the Spanish pastor, Father de Zamora, at the Opelousas Post, had baptized one of the grandchildren of the original Vidrine who came, Jean-Baptiste Vidrine, in 1793, while Fr Barriere was still in Baltimore, right, before he came to Louisiana. But the Spanish pastor had written, as he heard, right, Jean-Baptiste Vidrine. Think about the French Vidrine in Spanish ears, right, hearing Vidrine, right? This is actually how some names were changed in Louisiana. The pastors recording the sacraments, or the civil authorities recording their names. So Fr Barriere comes behind years later, and he says, no, this is Lycée de Vidrine. Cette famille est noble et m'a été particulièrement connue à Bordeaux in 1770 Fr Barriere. So imagine that, right? He says, I know this family in Bordeaux, right, in France in 1770. And so he's correcting the record of the family here at the Opelousas Post, written incorrectly by a Spanish Capuchin, right? It's that kind of knowledge he had. It's tremendous to say, no, this is not the right spelling. It's actually this family, and I knew that family in Bordeaux in 1770, right? Tremendous. tremendous, really, that a priest would minister or know a family in France and minister to their children or grandchildren here in Louisiana, right, in that one lifetime. Tremendous. He buried my sixth great-grandmother, Elizabeth de Montchervaux, who had married Jean-Baptiste Lopez de Vidrine, the first Vidrine who came. And this was at the Opelousas Post, right? So the year 1816, the 7th of September, I, the undersigned, Michel Bernard Barriere, priest of the parish of St. Landry of Opelousas, have buried in the cemetery of the parish the body of Dame Elizabeth de Montchervaux, adult, around the age 60. She was the widow of Monsieur Pierre de Vidrine, ancien officier de Sa Majesté, ancient officer of His Majesty the King of France in this colony. She received all of the sacraments, and he wrote, lived for 3 long years and died in the Quartier dit du Baton Rouge in this parish. So we saw that already, right? So he visited her son, Pierre Vidrine, at his home, and he celebrated the sacraments at his home whenever he was in that area of Ville Platte. And she lived for 3 long years with him and sick before dying at his house, plantation, and then buried at the Opelousas Post Cemetery, St. Landry in Opelousas, right? So it's those kind of details, again, that he gives, right? Lived for 3 long years at the Quartier du Baton Rouge. You're able to make connections even as you know the records, right? You know he had been to the Quartier du Baton Rouge. So tremendous, really, in his labors. We know also of Fr Barriere at the Opelousas Post from Dr. François Robin. He was a doctor from France who came to Louisiana at the same time as Fr Barriere, the early 1800s, found himself in New Orleans and then moved to the Opelousas Post. Dr. Robin had a plantation on the St. Landry Prairie, today the beautiful road Paconnière, if you ever go there, in St. Landry Parish. And Dr. Robin became a farmer, even though he was a doctor here, and Fr Barriere used to go visit him often and minister to him and his family. So just a few years ago, letters were found in France that Dr. Robin had written to his family from Opelousas. They were published by L'Enclos, I forget his exact name, a descendant of Robin, but they're in English. You can find them at the library. Very insightful into life in the early 1800s, right, in Louisiana. But he mentions Fr Barriere in a few of his letters written to France, right? And his handwriting is not the greatest. Doctors are not known for great handwriting, right? But there he says in this letter in 1817, Fr Barriere, while returning to his parish in Opelousas, brought me your dear letter, writing to his brother. He just left after having dinner with me, which has given me all the opportunity that I need to look over more steadily this inestimable letter, which I regard as a favor from Providence. And he says, your name, good brother, and then goes on. But writing, Fr Barriere had dinner at his home, brought the letter that he had brought from France back to Opelousas. So apparently in those years in residence in Opelousas, he was able to travel a few times back to France because peace had been established, right, after the revolution. And he served as an envoy, in a sense, to Dr. Robin, bringing his letters to Bordeaux from Dr. Robin here in Louisiana. In another letter he writes, Fr Barriere, a native of Bordeaux with whom I am quite well acquainted, will be in charge of bringing my letter to Bordeaux, where it will be put in mail for Saint-Pé, where Dr. Robin's brother lived, which is near Lourdes in France. He said, I would very much like to make good on the expense that you will incur in order to write me. Then he goes on, I must discuss this subject with Fr Barriere, who will be very happy to be of service to me. He's a good and respected immigrant priest who, when the revolution erupted, took great risk of having his podex, he wrote, in Latin word for behind, right? Posterior hung upon a lynching post, Dr. Robin's words. Here we are on the 8th day before Easter. Dr. Robin likely wrote this letter in March or April, just before Easter in 1817. He said, "I will send my letter to Fr Barriere, who has promised me and has taken charge of rendering to me all that you will send to me here in Opelousas." So tremendous, right, that he also served, in a sense, as a link between France and Opelousas. And we have that record of that through the letters of Dr. Robin found just a few years ago. So, having served the Atacapa post and then having served the Opelousas post, the two oldest churches in the diocese, he was sent to become the first pastor of St. John at Vermilionville, as here at the cathedral. And that was in May of 1822. And so, remember that Father Souvé noted as early as 1804, while he was at Saint Martinville, that Fr Barriere would never fail to stop at the large plantation of Jean Mouton, right, Toncle de Chapeau, where he would always go. And once in a while he would also meet at the house of Marin Mouton, Jean's brother. And certainly all of you recognize the ancient majestic oak tree, right, well known here at the cathedral. And many speculate that Fr Barriere selected this specific plot of land for the church due to that grand oak tree, right? So it, at that time, had been here already a little over 275 years, right? So it's interesting, really, to think, having been the pastor of the Takapa post before there was a Vermilionville, he would stop at Jean Mouton's home and probably had his eye on that tree all along, right? I can imagine it caught his attention even that time. And when Jean Mouton said he would donate land for the cathedral, he chose probably this very spot where that oak is, right? Tremendous. But we also have some records from Fr Barriere, of course, here at the cathedral, the very first pastor of it. And this was the church up until the Civil War. This is a picture at the Civil War, right? And the wooden church that was built around the time of Fr Barriere as the pastor. So he writes in the Register of Baptisms and Funerals for the colored Catholics, black Catholics here in Vermilionville. He says, "The priestly functions have been exercised regularly in this parish during or about the month of June this last year, 1822. They were discharged by Father Brassac, rector of Grand Coteau, since about the time of the foundation of this church. Either the pastor of the Takapa, or myself, or the pastor of Grand Coteau took care of this place before." And says, "Finally, I was appointed resident pastor of it about May of last year, and since then have baptized in particular the following people," right? So very meticulous, very clear in his writing and giving history, if you will, of his writing. Even though he arrived at Vermilionville in 1822, the register for black people didn't begin until 1823, compiled again from various notes that had been recorded as he did before at St. Martinville. So perhaps this could indicate that Fr Barriere was now no longer the healthy and active missionary, right, who used to spend days and weeks traveling on horseback from farm to farm across the prairies to exercise his priestly ministry. It was a year after he arrived that he began to record those sacraments. The records at Vermilionville seem to indicate that they were written by an older man who was now weaker and more fragile, right? He had been in Louisiana nearly 30 years. For example, there's one note that he briefly mentions how sickness had slowed him down here at Vermilionville. He says, "I believe that these are all the baptisms of the slaves which I have performed, and also the burials at which I presided, during or since the month of June to December, all in 1822. But at that time I felt very sick. It may well be that I forgot some of them, especially burials. For this reason, I leave here these 2 blank lines to write them their own in case I should discover any, right? Very different in a sense than St. Martinville and Opelousas in terms of the records. He says, perhaps I have forgotten some of them. He probably did forget some because there are no entries of burials performed by him, even though there were many deaths during the fall of 1822 due to the yellow fever epidemic, right, that brought so many difficulties throughout Louisiana that year. So perhaps he did forget. He mentions his sickness again in another interesting entry of the burial of one of his own parishioners. There he says, Casimir, a Negro, died and was buried in the cemetery of this parish, the 2nd or 3rd of the year 1823, during my great illness. He was the natural son of Marie Louise and Michel, who were slaves. He writes, signs, Fr Barriere, pastor of St. John. So he tends to mention that great illness he had, perhaps just the wearing down of the years, or maybe even some kind of real sickness, we don't know. But it was apparent that he wasn't able to do here at St. John what he had done at the 2 previous posts, right? Particularly with great missionary zeal. So after he recovered from what he called his great illness, he completed his pastoral duties quietly and humbly for about another year here at Vermilionville. And the active missionary life, which had been a great part of his priestly service for so many years on the Louisiana bayous and prairies, was now more difficult. And he approached the age of 70, probably yearning to see his native land once again, right, in France. And so the final funeral that Fr Barriere celebrated at Vermilionville was on March 1st, 1824. And his last baptism was a few days later on the 5th of March, 1824. And so shortly after, he sold his animals and tools, things he had, and then he boarded the ship for his native land of Bordeaux after having lived and worked faithfully in Louisiana for 30 long years, right? Now, some historians in Louisiana, even early on, incorrectly state that Fr Barriere died 8 days after going back to France, right? That's incorrect. It's really 8 years after going back, which I'll talk about in a minute. But Jim Bradshaw, as you know, great columnist and likes to write short stories, has that he died 8 days after he went back to France. So I contacted him once and said, I found the records of him being pastor in France going back for 8 years, not 8 days. You might want to, consider that. And he said, well, it makes a good story, right? So, or it sounds good. It's a good story. So he did return to France in 1824. He left here in May and was in Bordeaux by December 1824. By that time, he met France having had peace. The Concordat was signed, the revolution was over, and he was able to return as a priest faithfully there. So he arrived in Bordeaux in December of 1824 and offered his services to the Archbishop. Think about this, he was almost 70 years old by then. And some thought he would be given an important parish because of his background as a missionary and faithful to his faith instead of caving to the atheistic government. But it's also a reality, right, that he was a little older now. So the Archbishop wanted to give him a parish near the city of Bordeaux, Sucat, which had been without a pastor since the Revolution, and he refused to go there, saying perhaps something maybe a little smaller, right? But I think just as he had done here in Louisiana, spent his time in the woods, if you will, right, in the distant parts, he was given a parish outside of Bordeaux, literally in the forests, and it was another parish that had had no priests for over a quarter century, right, since the Revolution. So it was Cabanac and Villagrain, which here on the map is, as you can see, just south of Bordeaux, but technically in the woods, in the forests. And, he was appointed pastor on December 1st, 1824. And his arrival was in many ways providential for the people of Cabernac, right? They welcomed him with great enthusiasm, even though there was no longer a rectory, since the last one had been taken over by the state and sold. The parishioners gathered to raise money to build a new rectory for their pastor, and they all participated in raising the money and building the rectory. He found himself really surrounded by that same spirit of the people that he had served in Louisiana, right? Hungry, in a sense, for the faith, and he was able to generously meet their needs. He served there for just about 8 years, where he died on October 2nd, 1832. So, 1832. And there's a plaque in the church at Cabernac. This is a church that's there today in Cabernac, south of Bordeaux, but it's not the church Fr Barriere had served. It was a different church, stone, but destroyed at the Revolution. And this one was built about 30 years after Fr Barriere had served in the church there. But there is the death certificate of Fr Barriere that we have in Bordeaux on October 2nd, 1832, died. And this is the plaque in the church at Cabernac, which the parishioners put up in his memory. So, to the memory of Father Michel Bernard Barriere, baptized at Saint-Maximin, Bordeaux, June 1755, ordained at Baza, May 1782, appointed chaplain of the Foundling Hospital in Bordeaux, incarcerating during the Torment, the Revolution, compelled to embark for America, carried on his ministry in the Atacapa region for 30 years, suffered for the faith, returned to France in 1824, successfully restored the parochial life in Cabernac-Villagrain, where he died full of merit on October 2nd, 1831 there. So rest in peace, right? You can see the gratitude of the people at Cabernac that he served for nearly 8 years, returning from France as an older priest, right? Just a few years ago, I had the great privilege of going back to Cabernac and offering Mass for his soul in 2018. That's 2 years before COVID hit. I was there for the 275th anniversary of the first Vidrine, who came from France to Louisiana, my sixth great-grandfather, and took the opportunity to go to Cabernac and offer Mass for his soul in the church there. And this is the article that was written in Sud-Ouest, the magazine or the newspaper of Bordeaux. Who would have ever imagined that one day a priest would come from Louisiana to Cabernac and Villagrain to pay homage to one of his confreres who died on October 2nd, 1831. Yet this is what happened, the article says, as a small group of 20 faithful gathered in the Church of St. Martin this Tuesday, July 3rd at 11 a.m. with Fr Jason Vidrine during a Mass celebrated by the pastor, Father Albert Kern. It gives a little history of Fr Barriere, the same one that you find on the plaque. And then it says, he exercised his ministry for 30 years, notably with the Atacapa, Native American people of the southern part of Louisiana, and often with families who came from France, about which he left many writings. And so he knew well the ancestors of Father Vidrine, the latter in France to celebrate the 275th anniversary of his sixth great-grandfather, was obliged to come to Cabernac and Villagrain, where Father Michel Bernard Barriere found a new mission after his return to France in 1824, reconnecting the commune with the life of a parish after staying more than 10 years without a priest. Quotes me just saying, I had a desire to give thanks for the life of Father Barriere, who manifested his kindness to the people of Louisiana. And he says, if a plaque above the door of the sacristy testifies to the life of Father Barriere, his life remains unknown to the general public. It's very much thanks to this distant visitor that the local religious history may be a little better known, right? So, what did I write in that article about 8 years ago, right? Concluding it, Father Barriere lived an extraordinary life as a tremendous priest, and that life should be better known, particularly by those who owe much to his loving service, to their ancestors and their parish's history, right? So, Perhaps that visit to Cabernac by a priest from Louisiana stirred up a little interest, and actually after that I received email from several of those. They were excited and even wanted to twin Lafayette with Cabernac, right? And I had to tell them Lafayette's already twinned with a few other villages, right? But the excitement there, just knowing a pastor that they didn't really know but have seen as in a plaque on the wall of the church, right, affected the lives of people in South Louisiana in a tremendous way, right? And went back there to serve them and died faithfully there. So it can be argued, and I think it is demonstrable, that Fr Barriere is really the one we owe for the seeds being planted as a foundation in what we call Acadiana today, having served Saint Martin de Tours, then Saint Landry in Opelousas, then founding the cathedral. He literally established the faith in a real way in terms of ministering to people, as I've said, in these salidas, these little missionary journeys. And with that knowledge of people in France serving their family in Louisiana, he was able in a way to link the two, right? And it's thanks to him, not only that the Cathedral of St. John the Evangelist was founded and became a parish, but that we have so much knowledge through his records of families that we descend from, right? So I think that beginning a bicentennial year of the cathedral, right, affords that opportunity to know a little more about its first pastor, right? And you can see as you walk in the cathedral the list of pastors, right? So next time you're in the foyer of the cathedral, look at that marble plaque with the list, and first name that's there is Father Michel Bernard Barriere, right? And what a tremendous witness to the faith that he gave, not just in the life he lived, in the ministry that he generously offered, but in the death that he had as one faithful to the church, faithful to his faith, not giving in to the atheistic government of the revolution, came all the way to South Louisiana to minister to the French here, and then went back to help recover the faith after the revolution, especially in that parish that had been without a priest for almost 15 years, right, where he died. The curé of ours, Saint Jean Vianney, says, leave a parish without a priest for 5 years, and parishioners will be serving devils, he said, right? Meaning, without a pastor and pastoral care, it's easy to give ourselves to all of that is not of Christ and the faith, right? So what a job he had going back to France after serving here to bring back the faith, but they were excited to welcome him back, and that plaque on the wall of their church testifies to their gratitude to his faithful ministry, dying in Christ's grace, but dying almost as a martyr and dying as a great servant of the Lord, right? So to his memory, to all that he did, we're indebted, and certainly he deserves to be better known and appreciated and even prayed for, right, as one faithfully serving the church. All right. Are there any questions that you might have, or anything not clear? Anything? Awesome. Yeah, that's a great question. So in some records, his name is written as Miguel Barriere, and actually we even have that, I think, in some of these records in Opelousas for sure. The reason why it was Miguel Barriere is because those were the times under the Spanish government, right? He came as Michel Barriere, but was willing to and really did serve the Spanish government. As you may know, there was a lot of animosity between the French and the Spanish at the time, and Fr Barriere came at the will of the Spanish government. As I said, he was arrested, right, thinking he was a French spy, and they allowed him to come in. So he would often write the records in French, but he would sign with a Spanish name, right, kind of in homage to the government, Miguel Barriere. he very often was able to read the Spanish, it seems, right, and understand it. But I'm not sure how much Spanish he might have actually spoke, just like how much English he might have spoke. I'm not sure. But so you'll see Miguel Bernardo Barriere is the way he would sign it sometime. Or he would just sign Father Michel Barriere. But yeah, that's a great question. It was the Spanish government that he came under. Of course, while he was here at the cathedral, it had become America while he was serving in St. Martin de Tours, and then while he was here, it was America. So he was here literally when America was bought by the American states, sold by France, and he was here when Louisiana actually became a state in 1813, right? And so you can imagine the times he lived in here, that development of our state and our culture here. Any other questions?
It's amazing that he did all of that on horseback.
Yes. Either by boat in the bayous, but mainly by horseback, because he went on the prairies, right? He was going to these different plantations and habitations. So he would saddle up the horse and go, and then go back to his parish by the weekend and offer masses and be with the people. Tremendous missionary spirit. Father Chester has his hands full as pastor of the cathedral, right? But it's not pastor of all of the area, right? Father Barriere was pastor of the whole area, right? And how amazing was that? Of course, there were less people then, but still many inhabitants, and he did it faithfully. Different times. When I was pastor in Baden, there's a mission between Baden and Kaplan in the country, St. David, and I would often think about that, right? On a Sunday morning, I would go from an 8 o'clock Mass in Baden, 7 o'clock Mass in Baden to an 8:30 Mass at St. David, but that's like 20 minutes in between. Imagine in the old days saddling a horse and having to go to a mission. You couldn't go, in that amount of time. So it took time, no doubt. He was away for a few days going to these different habitations, but then would come back. So if you've never read it, there's a great book called 1 Mile an Hour. Monsignor Turlings wrote as memoirs of his ministry here, a little later, obviously, than Father Barriere, but he was pastor at the cathedral. And he talks about going on horseback through the Cameron Marshes, right? 1 mile an hour on horseback, right? You can imagine even earlier Father Barriere doing that in all his little salidas, his little journeys. All of it. All of it. Imagine. And the fatigue when he got back from these, you can imagine, right? But he did it with great fidelity. So, hey, Deacon.
You mentioned he was rather ill at the time of the yellow fever outbreak. Didn't suppose he might have been yellow fever. Is there reason to think he died of yellow fever?
Well, most people who had yellow fever died because they couldn't treat it very well, right? That's why there were so many deaths with that epidemic. But he could have. He just called it his great illness. So I think it was more probably just either one of the sicknesses that come with old age or just a weak spirit that, any of those, called it a great illness. But we don't know the nature of that great illness. The only way we know that he was sick is his own writing that in the registers during my great illness, right? We haven't been able to find any doctor's records. There might be some even, but we haven't been able to find them. Sadly, we haven't been able to find a picture of him or at least some kind of image of him. There was one of Father Baden I showed you, that first priest in America he served with in Kentucky, right? But none of Father Barriere, so perhaps one day one will show up. We don't know. Well, very good. Thanks for your attention and interest. And I think the lineup of the talks for the lecture series are really great, and the development of them from the first pastor to history of the Black Catholics in Acadiana to the Hispanics and the others. So certainly try to come to those, spread the word, and I think it's a great opportunity for our cathedral, for our diocese in this bicentennial year. Chester.
Thank you so much for giving us your time. He's the new pastor of St. Martin de Tours. In St. Martinville, you must take an opportunity to see our oldest church of the diocese. It's really beautiful grounds. I'm giving you that claim, okay? I know there's St. Landry, there's a dispute of some churches, but that you're the new pastor there. I know people are excited to have you there. I want to share a little story about what I did to Fr Vidrine. I had the privilege of having him as a newly ordained with me at the Catholic Student Center, and Father has always been very zealous. And one day after Mass, there was a lady that came up to me and she said, "Father, there was a great vision behind you, and I saw a multitude. I don't know where it was, the angels, and what all of that means." I said, "You see that door open over there? There's a newly ordained priest who studied in Rome, and he studied visions. He can explain it to you." All of a sudden, he sticks his head out the window, and he looks at me, and he points.
It wasn't the only one he sent to me.
Yeah, I sent many, and he was always a gracious servant, to help, especially people we had a lot of special needs and those who need special guidance at the student center. And, there's another little thing together when we were there. I think our ministry, youth ministry, could be sometimes challenging. I think within the first semester between, what is the place on Johnson Street that burnt? Mel's Diner and Borden's, Bluebells, we gained about 30 pounds, both of us. So the next semester we made it a commitment to fast because it was Lent, so that they could see our spiritual commitments also. But thank you so much, Father, for your knowledge and journeying with us through the beautiful history of our diocese. Thanks again. Christy, you would like to say anything?
I just want to say thank you to the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, for the generous grant that allows us to put on different humanities programs. There's some questionnaires in the back. If you wouldn't mind just filling out a quick evaluation. When I turn that into the granting agency, it shows them that supporting humanities in non-secular institutions are valuable and that people do appreciate it. So thank you so much. Thanks for coming.